thanks again to GE for the reception. That was super on the back porch here. And I know a lot of people hit the town. Some went to Vietnamese restaurants, but hopefully everybody had a good time last night in Corpus here. Today's agenda is just as filled. There's some great panels, and we start out with Mr. Josh Kennedy from AMCOM Logistics Center and Mr. CW5 Washabaugh, who's the PEO Aviation Logistics Officer. So we're glad to have you here, and we look forward to hearing your comments this morning. So thank you.
Well, good morning, all. Greetings from the, we call ourselves the dynamic duo from AMCOM and PEO Aviation here. We're going to be talking to you this morning about the newer processes that we're putting in place between AMCOM and PEO for the aviation branch in terms of airworthiness sustainment out there. So, outline that we're going to quickly follow here over about the next 20 minutes is to line out what our current airworthiness process is, talk to you about why we see a disjointed aviation maintenance policy that's kind of evolved over the last 2 decades, a refined process, and we're going to introduce what we're going to call AR95-4, which you'll see come out from Army Publishing Director towards the end of the month, or so they promised me. Therein, and talk to you about why it's important for Army Aviation as a whole in terms of a brand new AR that coalesces our sustainment strategy for airworthiness and aviation maintenance policy therein. So, without further ado, our current airworthiness process is envisioned in a dynamic graphic here, and we do a really good job over the years. We mostly think in airworthiness in terms of the design to production modification arrows that you see up here, and it's always been governed by the DoD 5000 series, been governed by 70-1, and most visibly and emotionally for most of us around the Redstone apparatus is AR 7062, which is airworthiness qualification of aircraft systems. We also use a litany of aeronautical design standards. You can go read those at some point. There's about 40 of them, and you better hang on tight when you're reading through them. Because they're the guts of how we work the design and production and modification cycle therein, largely written by AED type guys and aerospace engineer there. However, the sustainment aspect of airworthiness is not quite governed through a statutory and regulatory process. AR 750-1 starting, it's our aviation maintenance, it's the Army's maintenance management policy. You see a little bit of effort in there from AR 95-1, which talks about weight and balance. It talks about minimum equipment list. But after that, you start to rely on a series of TMs, TBs, training circular, et cetera, that governs the process therein. And though unstated through all this, we're trying to use all that to increase what we call the maintenance-free operating period, which is the interval from inspection to inspection. So the less time an aviation maintainer is spending is going to have to touch that aircraft to do either scheduled and unscheduled maintenance. That's what we mean by the MFOP. So we're dedicated to ensuring that airworthiness, that we ensure an airworthiness platform, but how to reduce that risk while increasing that MFOP or maintenance-free operating period, and thus reducing the resource consumption in terms of man-hour, labor, parts, et cetera, on the flight line. We're trying to find a way to get to the policy means of helping establish that, which is, at this point, as you can see, is a more disjointed effort, coalesced in a series of PAMs, rigs, TMs, et cetera. All right. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Washabaugh to talk a little bit about what our maintenance policy looks like right now.
So basically right now what we have is an uncoordinated effort that's focus point through your maintenance officers that are out there in the aviation community. They're familiar with all the PAMs, the regulations, the TMs that tie this together, outlined. The Army Maintenance Management System and the Army Maintenance Management System for Aviation were outlined in the AR 738, 750, and then consequently the DA PAM 738, 751. That was our system for sustaining airworthiness. It also was the documentation and procedures for ensuring the critical safety component items and all of our historical records were taken care of and what was necessary. As the regulations evolved and Army has changed some of its maintenance practices, aviation was left behind with a pamphlet out there that did not have an overarching and governing regulation. Consequently, as we automated some of the processes that were in 738, 751. First, all we did was automate the forms, and then we automated some of the processes, but not everything. aviation maintenance and aviation airworthiness sustainment has been left behind and woefully lacking in some areas, and the authorities that are necessary, so that we could take advantage of the technologies that are emerging and utilize them in maintaining and sustaining airworthiness while providing the tactical commander the flexibility to manage his resources. Take the P4T2 with what he's got and tie that into sustaining a safe fleet and increasing availability and readiness. We talk about the current policies that we have in 32823. That's the TM 11500, 32823. There's a lifing policy, which is basically your retirement components, your time change components, your condition change components, and the windows thereof that are allowed, the 10% window that's allowed. A lot of folks do not understand the window applications in there, that it's not critical to be on, quote unquote, the backside of a window, but that window is developed and worked through our engineering directorates so that if you follow everything in there, you're guaranteeing the airworthiness of the aircraft. But it's very limited in scope. It's a 10% plus or minus 75 hours. We have components that go for longer times, but we don't have that window that's been extended. And as we get to the ability to monitor these components, we're reducing the flexibility of the tactical commander to sustain his aircraft and maintain that airworthiness that's necessary. Same thing with events, an event-based policy that we have right now. That's a calendar event, an hour event, or some sort of operational event that requires maintenance on the aircraft. Every so many hours, you'll inspect this. Every so many calendar days, you'll do this. If you fly in salt areas, you'll do this. If you have things in volcanic ash. So those are your event-based policies. Those are outlined in 32823, and they have been the stalwart and the foundation for what we do. But as we move forward with technology and we apply this with what we have, we can get towards an examination-based policy that will take us away from just strictly an event or a time-driven aspect of things to where we get to truly deal with things that happen over a period of time that we can measure and monitor with condition items. CBM is a prognostic tool, not a way of doing business. It supports reliability-centered maintenance, which is a methodology, but all of that ties towards examination-based policy, and when we get to merge that technology future, we'll be able to also get towards regime recognition, changing our phases, phase cycles, and now things that have to be overhauls. All of that process isn't well defined. It's pulled in from all this myriad of regulations and PAMs that are out there. It's going to consolidate this under the airworthiness policy. Next slide. So, well, as I discussed a little bit before, the TAMSA generated outside the aviation community, CASCOM and other entities that look at what we deal with have looked at the TAMSA, and basically the 738, 751 is just a forms and records manual without understanding the policy and the process behind it. As we develop new things that have recordings and information that's out there, we have been told that at different aspects, we're going to change the way we do a process because it fits a computer program instead of a computer program that's going to support our process. And that's to guarantee an airworthy and available aircraft to the tactical commander. There's no policy that's allowed behind it. There's implications from 750-1 about following ADS 79 and the TM, but it does not specifically state that this is policy. AR 95-4 will dictate that policy of things that we've already been doing that we already tie together.
So what you're about to see different hit the street here from Army Publishing Division will be the introduction of the 95-4 series, Army Regulation 95-4, which is going to be called the Aviation Airworthiness Sustainment Policy and Procedures, and it will take over and incorporate a lot of what many of the old schoolers knew as the 328-23 series, the 204-23 series, and some other arcane TM and TB language that scattered our aviation maintenance policy among a couple of places. It brings it out of the TM, TB land and up to a regulatory areas from there in. It's also going to take over DAPAM 738, 751 and turn that into DAPAM 95-4. Okay, and I leave the point X on there because we have every intention of having do 95 4.1 and point 2 at least. So you tie a PAM to a rig, which gives us real teeth for Army Aviation to be able to run its own aviation maintenance policy business in the long haul, and not have it dictated to us by various IT systems and outside of our particular houses. Well, I never say that aviation is special, but we do have our own ways that we want to do business that are not necessarily coherent with a lot of the ground maintenance policies that we see of other parts of our Army therein. We'll continue to use the Training Circular 3.04-07, which for those of us who've been around for a while, that's the old 1-500 Aviation Maintenance Management FM. We'll continue to, that'll be in a trio of documents that say this is how we're going to do business. The 95.4 talks about it as an enterprise level. The Training Circular continues to govern. This is what tactical flight line maintenance will look like and structured all the way out through the enterprise aspect from therein. So what you get out of all of this is a more coherent regs and policy family in order to drive maintenance, in order to ensure our airworthiness sustainment cycle. So it's not just in that design and production piece of it, but we get to make sure that we tie it all the way through the sustainment aspect. And so I don't need to give many of you the old DAU 101 pitch that Army Aviation spends 80% of its life cycle monies out in sustainment land, yet our regulatory structure only governs the design and production aspects of it right now. But we know that the center of the universe, the center of gravity for Army Aviation is its maintenance policy, and the way it does business is what truly makes us a branch outside of just flying airplanes around on the battlefield there. And all right, turn it back. So what are you going to see in 95.4 that's important? So first things it says a couple of key things in there. First, that the purpose of airworthiness sustainment is to reduce risk and increase that maintenance-free operating period, and that we make it our policy that going from inspection to inspection, the time that a young maintainer has to touch that airplane for any reason, that's the goal. That's the goal of what we're doing. So you want to be able to give tactical policy out there where there's increased time. So you've seen other S&T initiatives for zero maintenance aircraft. I know that's a long ball throw, but what we're really talking about is if you can go from 10 flight hours between the time you touch an airplane out to 50 hours or more because you've aligned your maintenance policy to do it, that's what you get. And it establishes our maintenance policies in three key things. It gives you the basis for component life, which we already know out in TMs and TBs, brings it to an AR. It talks about event-based policy, again, bringing it to an AR. But then it formally says we're going to pursue an exam-based policy that's going to rely on reliability-centered maintenance, technology application where applicable, and getting to a condition-based approach on components and overall aircraft, and doing that in certain situations, conditions, or incidents that are driven through those. The other key thing you see is you always look to Chapter 1 of any regulation to find out what the responsibilities are. It puts the AMCOM Commanding General as a technical proponent for aviation sustainment therein. So this is a new piece. It confirms that the PEO Aviation, right now General Marion, will be the configuration and control. When you put those together, it gives those two the shared responsibility for airworthiness sustainment. And that is now written down in a way that was implied before. Now it's put down into one document therein. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Washabaugh for the last word here.
So in evolving to an examination-based policy, for example, we have a lot of operational limitations, and then we have maintenance limitations. With the ability to collect the digital sources that we have from condition indicators and just normal operational aspects, it'll marry that up to where we have a safety limitation and not so much as an operational one. You look at an aircraft that has an overspeed, over temp, over torque. Operationally, it'll go in there to stop operations, and again, managing the exceedance. You stop the operation, you write it down, and then you go to the maintenance manual and it says no action required, or make a write-up on the historical records, and that's it. Well, we have the ability to collect all of this data. So over in between the scheduled inspections, as we take that into consideration, all of this data will collect between the inspections, and then from those events, that examination will be determined for that next inspection series. Instead of just maybe a visual inspection, it might say places, components. That's the policy that we're getting towards and working with, the ability that's out there. We haven't had that authority to do that before. It's always been implied along the lines, and working in the conjunction with PEO AMCOM and RDCOM for all the engineering that we'll need and require in there. We own the resources to adjust our maintenance policy, but we haven't had the authority to do that in a lot of cases along the way. This is not a new thing. It's not anything that's different. I can talk about an old 1544 that talked about flight operations for maintenance test flights, 500, 511. All that stuff eventually moved its way into the TM 1500, 32823, but there's no teeth to it. So when you tell somebody that you're managing in accordance with this, even though the 750-1 lies in there, you still have other supply policies and maintenance policies that are contradictory to what we do for airworthiness. This allows that authority for the commander, the tactical commander, to make the decisions that are necessary to keep his operation running and still sustain the airworthiness, and then we can work towards it. This is a policy that will help the battalion and brigade commanders prosecute their actions, train their troops, and then sustain airworthiness. And through practice and application, ultimately will reduce cost as we increase the maintenance-free operating period for the aircraft. It's not new. It's just a collection of everything that we've had in one source document and then giving the authority to what we've always done. Back to you.
Okay. So in conclusion, like I said, at the end of this month, where you'll see a refinement in the way that in the maintenance policy for Army Aviation in terms of you'll see AR 95-4 hit the street. That will belong to AMCOM as a proponent for that in conjunction with DAG-4. One of the first things that we're going to do is turn right back around and begin to transition the 738, 751 PAM into 95-4 PAM and bring that back inside of our house, in the aviation house, and then we'll work on a series of revisions straight out of there. But first we want to control our maintenance policy through our own regulation and then solidify it for the long haul where it's being run out of the combined Redstone and Rucker apparatus. So it's 8:20. I got a few minutes left. I'd like to open the floor for questions.
Oh, turned around. There's more audience here than there was when you started. Good job, guys. Oh, there's some people in here. Here we go.
Garner Pogue, CK Commander. So I think that one of the things that kind of getting kicked around, and I've been talking about with General Richardson a little bit and some other folks, we give back an awful lot of maintenance in the Army. We over-maintain our aircraft, and we give back flying hours all the time. So I know that there's never been an aviator that padded any time, but all the padded time is maintenance, that is readiness that's been given back. Anytime we drop an aircraft into phase early, we're giving maintenance back. Anytime we drop an aircraft into phase early and remove components because those components aren't going to make it to the next phase, we've given those hours back and that maintenance back. And it just goes on and on and on. You get into theater, you got this whole phase team of contractors sitting there, and what's the first thing you do with one of your aircraft that just got reset? You drop it into phase. So over time, it's hundreds of millions of dollars of maintenance we've given back. What have you heard? Like I said, we've been kicking this around for a while now. Are there any discussions at your level about how to really go after that low-hanging fruit and change the way we're really start maintaining our aircraft instead of over-maintaining them? And I think there's some industry best practices we could glam on to. But what, if anything, have you guys been talking about, and could you describe any initiatives that you know of?
I'll start.
Go ahead, Mark.
Sir, back to the discussion with the 95-4, and I'll just go with the 328-23. A lot of personnel, and as you talked about, we've given a lot of maintenance. Our op tempo has been very heavy, and you get a lot of work from guys that run out of time. You know, fast, cheap, or right, pick two. That's about what we got. So in areas where we'd have a depot level repairable, where you remove it, you inspect it, you replace a couple components, you put it back on again, patchy main rotor head, field experience, about 4 guys, 2 days, get it done, or I can change a head out in 4 hours and send the work back to you. That's where I'm trading time for availability. You talk about the hours. Right now, our hours are plus or minus 10%, not to exceed 75 hours, so they don't even align with our phases and our other scheduled inspections. So I have 15 hours left on a component, but it won't make it to the next phase, the next 120 hour or 200 or something like that. So we pull it out. We haven't had the authority because it was just a TM before that the commanders had to work with. You work with the regulation first, then we can start graduating some of these components. Plus or minus 10%, not to exceed 75 hours on things maybe less than 1,000 hours. Between 1,000 and 2,000 hours, we might be able to get it to the next phase with an easy process of getting letters of authority, DMWARs and things like that. That's not an easy process, but none of this is mapped out, and that's where we're going with it, and some of this will allow us to look at it as we have our own authority inside the aviation community to adjust our maintenance because we have our policy that's tied to it and not following an larger Army policy. The same reason why we went from a 55 series TMs, right? I'm dating myself, 31 years, right? Trucks, right? We used to all be under truck maintenance, and then we went to aviation series, 1 series. This is just the next step in that evolution to allow us that authority to do that, and kind of ties together with some of the applications and management aspect so that the time can be managed a little more efficiently at the tactical level, and you don't have to pay for and do 10-level maintenance back there at the depot. Does that answer, cover?
I'll layer on a little bit with that, sir. So Mr. Washabaugh talks about one of the big things we're doing is is updating our policy to allow that kind of thing to happen, allow it to, frankly, smarter maintenance, across the enterprise to do it. Other initiatives that are discussed and worked by pockets of people in a unfortunately not coordinated, deliberate fashion are things like fleet management applications, condition-based maintenance, which is really, in its purest sense has been addition to HUMS boxes on the airplanes and how to work that. Groups of hardworking people spread all around Redstone and guys at Rucker getting there, but it hasn't had that coordinated, deliberate approach as an aviation enterprise being driven by a specific document written out of our branch to do that. And that's not to throw a stone at a lot of miraculous, hardworking guys down at Rucker do that, as I drive back and forth there quite a bit. But we do that kind of push. To get there is not necessarily becomes an inferred or implied requirement for the branch to drive down your maintenance burden, decrease the cost of your current flying hour, find a way to get parts demands, get demands for parts reduced in the long haul by harnessing and exploiting an array of data systems. All these are grand ideas, and they're very good ideas, and they're pockets of people that sit around in AMCOM Logistics Center or engineering director at AED or guys sitting at MED here or ACLC down there. There's pockets of folks that do that, but they do it without a governing document. They do it on an inferred or implied need, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a program of record, but you can't tie resources to it, you can't tie structure to it, and what we know is the art of possible for driving that stuff down. We all know we do maintenance more than we need to, but the ability to coordinate our house in there is not tied to a document or a series or a thrust of things. That's Josh's perspective therein. That's kind of some of the world I operate when I try to coordinate aspects between PEO, AMCOM, AED, try to spend money to try to drive these things. Just doing little things like set up a data repository that coordinates a lot of data sources to be extremely useful. I'm under very strict restrictions about the CBM data warehouse can only hit these 5 sources and can't do any software updates to it. It can just store, but it can't do any analytics under it, and that's governed by the Army G6 of the world. I can't get past that because we operate off more of an inferred or implied need for that kind of thing.
Josh stumbled on something that ties in there. Having dealt with the Navy and some of the NAVC operations that are out there,
yeah.
With the destroyers, they have embraced the technology of utilizing 3D printers and having that while a ship's underway that they can manufacture their own spare parts, things like that. They have their own separate policies for this. Under current Army guidelines, current Army policies, and how maintenance is set up within the Army structure, without the airworthiness component tied in the authority, this is why I say we have the authority to get to where we're at. If we had a 3D printer, and I'll use the generator spline adapters, would be a perfect thing to make in there. You wouldn't have to store that part. You wouldn't have to know where that part is. You could just manufacture it for yourself with a 3D printer. However, That would be owned by DUMS, G6, and the Office of Business Transformation. So any data that we'd have to move from AED to the unit to get out there, tie that together, wouldn't be authorized on us under current policies because that's just maintenance and that falls into other things. Whereas if we talk about it as portion of an airworthiness sustainment and the tools and requirements for there, we would probably be able to exercise and utilize that technology.
There was another piece in Garner's question about commercial best practices. Does anybody look at, Southwest or anything? How do these guys do it? Obviously, safety is critical to their enterprise as well, but they also are.
So I used UPS and Delta as much as Southwest as an example. So getting past the profit motivation versus the combat power motivation, we'll kind of step all that. So what Delta Airlines is able to do is put under one roof, under one big quote unquote requirements document or their versions of it. They will align, here's the data collection that I need to have happen at A through D checks on an airplane, and to make sure that it all gets moved to a central data center sitting out there right outside the Atlanta airport. I'll employ an array of engineer, analysts, ops research types in order to harness and exploit. I'll find what my priorities are kicking our rear end in terms of demanding too much parts or it's causing too much time in a B-level check there, and then I will institute and I will find root causes of that and institute processes to change, to make a change there, whether it's find ways to, to work through the TBO of that or change the inspection interval of that, and then come back and measure and find out how it paid off, very much in terms of dollars spent, which in their case is usually people's time or hours spent, money spent on the actual demand time, and then they'll incorporate that right back to that airplane got back on the flight line faster. So they're able to vertically align, your word, vertically align all that very fast versus what does Army Aviation deal with? I'm dealing with the G4, Office of Business Transformation, AED, PMs, Rucker, AMCOM. All those people, good, hard-working people, want to work with each other, but don't necessarily work for each other. Okay, with a series of rigs and policy documents and 5,000 series that oftentimes set us up to go head-to-head rather than pulling on the same set of oars.
There's a slight difference, as Josh mentioned, between the profit motive and the commander's combat power motive. They're maintaining an airworthiness program as outlined by the FAA and tied into a larger infrastructure that's set up for them, reducing their cost for profit, more or less, and I'm going to probably get in trouble for this, as a fix-to-fly program, where the aviation and the Army in general does a preventative maintenance program. That's why we over-maintain, because we're trying to manage, and this is going to sound kind of a little bit difficult here, unscheduled events. And we want to provide the greatest availability, not necessarily readiness, but the greatest availability to the commander that's out there. And that gets into, when you look at a window, more commanders will take the conservative approach because that's how we are in human nature, instead of always managing the resources that are out there to adjust. And then the thought of the quote-unquote backside of a window to tie into it. So the best practices aren't always applicable to what we do based on what the goals are and necessity that's out there. They have been looked at and tied together. There are some initiatives out there. But before we can take advantage of those things, we have to have an authority set up inside of our community that allows us to take advantage of this. And that's where we're going with this policy change. Right now, we don't have that authority to just take it, study it, and apply it because of all of the different organizations that are out there that believe they have certain controls on things which tie into our airworthiness in general.
Any last ones? Any last questions? Well, Josh and Don. We got time. We got time if you want to ask.
Okay, I'm going to ask have we looked at coming away from the traditional phase maintenance and going into what was very successful for the Kyle Warrior into a PPM, partial phase maintenance. We did some tests in the mid-90s, late 90s. We built a PPM for the Chinook and the Apache. Did it at Rucker as a test. It worked really well. The communities just weren't ready for that culturally yet. Have we looked at doing that? And that helps you with your time on wing and everything else to say, I can push to my next 40 or 60 hour PPM and not have to push to, 320, 700 hours.
If you remember in the 328.23, that's listed there, and that ability is there for all the aircraft that's out there. That hasn't been removed. But we haven't had the authority to look into that, to tie it together, because that was left down to the commanders to try and implement. We'll be able to relook at this as a process to guy in there. That's back to the earlier question from Colonel Pogue. We would tie into looking into that, the PPMs, or some other methodology. An examination-based policy and regime recognition are the next future areas towards that increase that level. That would take a PPM type of approach applied with the technology that's out there, and we get into regime recognition, which is going to give us more of a reliability, availability, capability that we're out there, as you can shuffle things back and forward as they're necessary. Is that?
Okay, Josh and Don, thank you so much
Yes,
for
sir.
your panel. It was a great panel. Greatly appreciate your time.
Thanks, sir.
And good luck.
Thanks, sir.